everyone, so today I wanted to talk about Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur and basically the controversy around it, because personally for me, I feel like ever since its release, all I've heard about it is people either loving it or people hating it and ripping it to shreds and like denouncing it as poetry and saying that it's all just like mindless thought or like a stream of conscious, not real poetry. So I wanted to just talk about it and sort of give you guys my opinion on it and my thoughts because I think it's interesting. And the main thing that I wanted to touch on was like the gatekeeping, because preparing for this video I did a little bit of research and I found that it just seemed like people were gatekeeping what is and isn't poetry and whether or not the book should be allowed into like the literary canon. So the book is often criticized for being very simplistic in style, and people often like call it like pseudo profound, and that it's actually not at all deep. It's very vapid, shallow poetry that like teenage girls admire. And you can find people parodying it and making fun of it, and it's like simplistic style. Fans of the work often stand up for it, saying that whilst its formatting is very simple, the topics that it tackles are quite heavy. And these topics covering the trauma and sexual assault of being a woman, but specifically also a woman of colour, as Rupi is South Asian. However, BuzzFeed, I found an article where they talked about the book, I'll link it below, but they argued that because of the really vague descriptions of trauma, that it makes the book come across as disingenuous. BuzzFeed explains that because Rupi blurs the line between personal and collective trauma, she is just exploiting the trauma and the history of South Asian women. BuzzFeed also explains that other poets feel like Rupi claimed to have inspiration from them, but was actually copying their style. And Nahara Waheed even says that a lot of the works are plagiarized and copied. But the poems were written to help empower women and reduce the stigma around sexual assault and menstruation and the trauma and heartbreak of breakups and relationships. And she has a particular focus on the systemic patriarchy that does naturally flow through a lot of these topics. And when talking about her own book, Rupi Kaur has said, "Our trauma escapes the confines of our own times. We're not just healing from what has been inflicted onto us as children. My experience have happened to my mother and her mother and her mother before that. It is generations of pain embedded into our souls." So I think it's very clear that through this, whilst she has been criticized for talking about the collective trauma, I think it's a huge influence within her life, and that when she speaks of trauma, she is trying to create a collective experience and make something that lots of South Asian women can relate to, and other women of colour who have also suffered similar trauma. Now I'm going to start talking about my own opinion on this, and I must admit, when I first started reading it, I was a little taken aback by the criticism of the book, especially when the criticism is often that the writing is very simple and vapid, because I didn't think that way at all, especially because poems are broken down into like 4 categories. The first one is the hurting, then the loving, the breaking, and then the healing. And the hurting is like all of her poems about like sexual assault and misogyny within the family and about sexual abuse in families. And it kind of took me by surprise that people were making fun of like the vapidness of her poetry, because for me, I kind of felt like it was a little strange to be making fun of the poems when she's tackling such heavy-hitting issues. And whilst the poems, it can be argued that they're simple, I think it makes them very accessible, especially when you compare it to other poetry that people like to call, real poetry. Those poems are often very hard to understand, and if you don't have any context surrounding them, I find myself that I don't get them. I don't understand what they were trying to say. I think to claim that modern poetry written like this is bad poetry is just like gatekeeping the literary canon and fueling the notion that the canon can only be full of white men, because that's primarily what it is. In recent years, people have tried to add more women to the canon, but I think completely disregarding an entire genre of poetry, it's very gatekeepy, and I think that's what my overall thoughts about all of this criticism are. For me, it's very gatekeepy. I also found that the very simplistic style of the writing was what made it so powerful and profound for me. I think it provided somewhat of an analogy. A lot of the poems are very simple, but they're very direct in their message. Like, for example, it's saying, if I don't say yes to sex, it's rape. Or, just because you called me smart when we were dating doesn't mean I'm not smart once you leave. It's very, sort of common sensey, but sometimes you need that reminder. Sometimes you need it just to be broken down very simply to just get the point across. Also, I think it's very powerful that the book was written by a woman of colour and that she became so successful. I think it's empowering to other women, and especially women of colour, to see someone overcome those boundaries, and even, overcome those boundaries talking about their experience. I think it's a very powerful thing, and it makes me wonder if this book would have received as much criticism as it did if it was written by a man. And for this, I want to compare Rupi Kaur and Gabby Hanna, who were both women who wrote very simple poetry, who copped a lot of slack online for it, to Bo Burnham, who also had the same style of simplistic poetry with accompanying illustrations. Now, this just could be me and the media that I consume, but when hearing about this book and Gabby Hanna's books, all I heard about them was that they were very simple, that they weren't real poetry, and that anyone could do it. Yet, I haven't heard any criticism of Bo Burnham, and I think it's just very telling that he is a white man. Now, to not be biased or anything, I compared searching up Gabby Hanna's poetry compared to Bo Burnham's poetry, and these were the results. Gabby Hanna's had lists and lists and lists of how awful her poetry is, and Bo Burnham had one result talking about how bad his poetry was. So I think that's just something to consider as well. I think what also is important to realise is that the whole book isn't just about sexual assault and trauma, because when I was researching why people thought it was so bad, other than just people critiquing the writing, a lot of the thing that I found was that people were sort of saying that they didn't feel like her depictions of trauma were accurate. But not the whole book is about trauma. Like I said, it's been broken down into 4 parts. And the part that's called The Loving is all about finding someone who you feel is your soulmate and loving them. There's nothing traumatic about it. And yet, you wouldn't know that had you not read it. Just to as a final note, I wanted to pull up some of the criticisms that people wrote, and I got this from a book called Bookster, and it's titled Hilariously Horrible Book Reviews of Milk and Honey. And I think this just sort of exemplifies my claim that a lot of the criticism is just very gatekeepy. It's people wanting to keep modern poetry away from what they think is real poetry. And so I just wanted to read out a couple of these reviews to show you that. So the first one: I had so much hope for this book since it had become so popular, so of course I was eager to read it. Unfortunately, this book just didn't cut it for me. I felt like I was reading a dramatic 15-year-old's diary. No. This is not poetry. These are thoughts that most of us have trouble crystallizing, that are about as deep as a puddle, full of the kind of poetry you posted to MySpace when you were 14. I don't understand the praise for this book. It's uninsightful, pseudo-profound garbage that you can find in Tumblr pasted on a picture of a flower, and in Tumblr it is free. None of these poems are original ideas. I literally hate everything about this pretentious yet simplistic nonsense. So I think just those couple of reviews sort of show that people are unwilling to accept this sort of modern contemporary poetry as real poetry. And I think that's quite a shame. To wrap up, whilst this book received a lot of criticism, I really enjoyed it, and for me, it really offered some insightful things. As you can see, I've got a bunch of sticky notes in it, which were all me marking down poems that I really liked and that I really connected to. I think Rupi Kaur's success has opened the eyes of so many people that women and women of colour can be successful, and that in their own right, and that they don't have to rely on somebody else for that success. And I think that that's a very inspiring story for so many people. And whilst the criticism is valid, of course, criticism is always valid, I suppose, much of the feedback I think comes from a place of gatekeeping, of not wanting to accept like common works into the literary canon. I think that people want to preserve the literary canon for a select few who are able to comprehend what is being written. Based off of everything that I've read, to be classified as a part of the literary canon, you need to exemplify the culture of the time and have, you know, a cultural impact. And I think that's what this book had. And so personally, I think to say that it's not literary canon worthy is just silly. And a book's success is not dependent on the fact of whether it can enter the canon or whether it can't. But that's all I have to say. Thank you for tuning into this video. Like and subscribe if you want to. And I will all see you in my next video. Bye!